Welcome back, you guys. Today we are mixing things up and we are making a vegan cake. So whenever I think of vegan baking, I think of it as something that's really intimidating and scary. And what I love so much about this recipe is that, as you can see from the ingredients, there's nothing crazy in it. It's normal ingredients that most people have in their pantries already, including the frosting. So it tastes great. This cake is going to be almond flavored, so it uses a bit of almond extract. And to replace the dairy, we're using some almond milk. So this recipe is so easy that we can actually mix it by hand in a bowl. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in as I create the batter so you guys can see exactly how to make it, and then we'll get to decorating this vegan cake. I absolutely love that this recipe comes together in one bowl. I began by mixing together my dry ingredients, which included all-purpose flour, granulated sugar, baking soda, and a bit of salt. Once these were all together in my bowl, I whisked them until they were combined. Next, I added in some of my wet ingredients, which included unsweetened vanilla almond milk, a bit of oil. Next, I added in my extracts, which include a little bit of vanilla, and of course some almond extract as well. The extract is really just for the taste, so if you prefer more or less, you can definitely adjust to your preference. So next, I whisked together my ingredients until the batter was nice and smooth and there weren't any more lumps. I always save adding the vinegar for last. It does react with the baking soda and kind of begins to bubble, and I really just think that the cakes turn out best when this is done at the very end of the process. So once my batter was nice and velvety smooth, I poured it evenly between 3 6-inch pans, which I sprayed with nonstick cooking spray, and I also lined with some parchment rounds. If you guys want to learn how to cut out your own parchment rounds, you can click the link in the upper right corner. I usually eyeball pouring my batter, but then I like to use a kitchen scale just to make sure that I have exactly the same amount of batter in each pan. This just makes it easier to get nice and uniformly sized layers. So I popped these into a preheated 350-degree oven for about 30 minutes, and once they had baked and cooled, I carefully leveled them using a serrated knife. You definitely don't have to level the layers since they do bake pretty flat already, but it does make it a lot easier to stack and frost the cake, so if you're comfortable doing it, I recommend that you do. Once all of my layers were prepared, I began to stack and frost them. So I built the cake on an 8-inch greaseproof cake board, and I just stacked my layers by placing them in the center and adding a pretty thick layer of my vegan frosting between them. This vegan frosting is very similar to how you make my regular American buttercream, but instead of using butter, we use some vegetable shortening. But we did add a bunch of almond extract, so it actually tastes pretty good. I was very pleasantly surprised by how the frosting tasted. Just a reminder, if you guys want the full recipe for this cake, it's up on Chelsweets.com, and the link is included in the description of this video. Once all of my layers were stacked, I added a thin crumb coat around the cake using my small offset spatula, and once I had smoothed that using my bench scraper, I chilled the cake for about 5 minutes in the freezer and then began to work on my second layer of frosting. Because the base for this frosting is shortening, it doesn't firm up quite the same way that butter does, so when you're frosting, it's a little bit more difficult to get it really nice and smooth, and it also doesn't really set in place the same way that a buttercream does. With that being said, I was still pretty pleased with my frosting job on this cake, and once I had finished smoothing it, I added some vegan sprinkles around the base. There's a bunch of different brands you can use, and if you Google vegan sprinkles, a ton of options will pop up. I chose to use this sprinkle blend made by Fancy Sprinkles, but you really have a ton of options for this. I carefully pressed the sprinkles around the base using a small offset spatula, and then I began to frost the top of the cake. So here I'm using my favorite frosting tip, which is an Ateco 869. It is a giant French tip, and once all of those little dollops of frosting were in place, I sprinkled a ton of that vegan sprinkle blend on top of the cake between the little dollops. I then went a little bit sprinkle crazy, and I also added some around the outside border of those dollops. I chose to keep the decoration for this cake pretty simple just by using those vegan sprinkles, but you could really get as creative with this as you wanted. So that's it. Now it's time to cut into the vegan cake and show you what the inside looks like. The best part about this cake is that it is just as delicious as it is simple to make. Don't forget, you can find the full recipe on Chelsweets.com, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to click the like button.